Hello, this is Francesca Recchia, and I would like to welcome you to a new conversation that is part of the collaboration between the Police Project and CAGE UK. We are meeting up once a month to understand the present through the events of the last 20 years. Today is a particularly meaningful day to discuss the ripple effects caused by the war on terror as the last American soldier stepped out of a plane, to leave Afghanistan. Today also marks the beginning of the International Witness campaign initiated by CAGE and with 40 global partners from 13 different countries. The campaign aims to highlight the impact and failures of this war. The rhetoric of the war on terror has become so pervasive and normalized that we barely pay heed to it anymore. Yet it is a global phenomenon that has multiple tangible effects on our lives, and it is largely built around the demonization of Islam and the implementations of laws and policies that openly targets the Muslim populations. Today we'll be interrogating questions of citizenship and belonging, and we look at how the war on terror has become a tool to legitimize worldwide Islamophobia. To unpack these incredibly complex and painful questions, we have with us Fahad Ansari and Asim Qureshi. Fahad Ansari is a practicing solicitor with over 15 years of experience working with immigration, asylum, and nationality law. Dr. Asim Qureshi is the research director at CAGE, and a UK-based advocacy organization working to empower communities impacted by the war on terror. He has a background in international law and is the author of several books, including the recent anthology, I Refuse to Condemn, where Fahad also has a chapter. Thanks very much, Fahad and Asim, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Let's start from the book that Asim edited and Fahad contributed to, I Refuse to Condemn. Asim and I spoke about the book already, but today I want to focus on a theme of what we may call conditional citizenship that is pretty much at the roots of the book itself. There seems to be a demand on Muslim citizens to prove their loyalty, to show that they are good Muslims. This can help us set the context for the discussion of today, and to understand what are the historical and political conditions for this conditional citizenship. This is open to both of you, so please, whomever wants to take it first.
Thank you, Francesca, for that introduction and for setting the tone for this conversation. As you rightly identify, I think really, although the book is about the specific expectation for Muslims and generally for people of color to condemn their communities, the real question that is at stake within the book isn't about condemnation per se, as much as it is about how we have to perform certain, kind of express actions in order to prove that somehow we are worthy of humanity, that somehow we are worthy of being included within the general citizenry of this country. And I think that really speaks to the heart of so many of the anxieties that the larger, more dominant communities within the countries we live in. And here we're specifically speaking about predominantly Western European countries or North America or Australia, where there is, for kind of Muslims living in diaspora, for Black people who have grown up in these countries, there is this commonality of experience that somehow, unless you play by certain rules, unless you speak according to a certain register, unless you kind of exhibit certain outward manifestations that make the dominant society comfortable with your existence, you're not welcome, and that you are somehow less of a citizen, that somehow you are seditious or a danger to society. And that's really where condemnation comes in. What they really want to know is, I need you to express to me out loud that you're not going to kill me in my sleep at night. That's really what they're asking. They're asking you to condemn terrorism, right? There is no expectation that you are just like everybody else, and you want to live a kind of normal, kind of healthy life like everyone else does, until you prove to them by outwardly expressing it. The expectation is that somehow you are still dangerous, that somehow you are still seditious.
I mean, I think, Asim, it's a bit broader than that. So the expectation that to prove that you're not going to wake up and kill somebody while they're sleeping is one level of it, and maybe it starts off with that. But I think over time we've got to a position where the expectation is, okay, we accept you that you're not a terrorist. However, your ideological underpinnings point you in that direction. For example, your position on the role of women in society, women's dress, charity even, and where it should be distributed. Issues about your political stance on certain issues in the Middle East, the roles of Muslim as a political entity. So all of these aspects are non-violent in nature, but they again are used to undermine your sense of belonging, and ultimately your sense of citizenship, because citizenship for me goes back to a sense of belonging to a certain nation, a certain state, a certain area. And if you are ultimately meant to feel that you don't belong because you have a different political outlook, a different religious belief, a different way of looking at things, but without compromising the fact that you still live in a part of that society where there's room for multiple views on different issues. And that room for discussion has been completely stifled over the last 20 years. And if there's any questioning it from a Muslim perspective, you are deemed to be suspect.
To follow up on this, there is also a question related to a notion that has been used and abused quite often over the past 20 years, and that is the idea of radicalization. Right? If you take a stand that is slightly different from the mainstream, then possibly you're radicalized and you've been brainwashed into some sort of radical anti-state ideology. And this idea of radicalization has been appropriated by the state and state agencies, and has become a way to limit the scope of citizenship and at the same time curb dissent. Because the moment you disagree, then you're, the idea of being deemed radical is the perfect label to cut any discussion. I suppose, Asim, maybe we can discuss this with you, because this the construction of a counter narrative to the idea of radicalization is very much part of the advocacy work that CAGE does. And the idea is to create a line of thinking that opposes the weaponization of this idea of radicalization. Can you tell us a bit about the work that CAGE does in this respect?
Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, I think we have to ask ourselves questions like, when they say that there is a threat from certain communities, how do they come to those conclusions? And the way that the state centers its narrative, it places the emphasis on change on the communities who are placed under suspicion. So it's up to us to change our behaviors rather than for government to take a mirror and have a look at itself, right? Because otherwise the narrative of radicalization doesn't fit. If for example, as MI5 told the government, before they invaded Iraq, that if you invade Iraq, then it's going to lead to disenfranchisement within certain communities, and it might lead to certain individuals taking acts of political violence, then, what needs to change here, of course, is the idea of, the ethics of what you're doing and what you're involved in. And regardless of that, they still go ahead. Now, when they do a review of this, the entire blame is placed on the feelings of disenfranchisement that communities feel. But you haven't listened to them in the first place. You've created an environment where it's not possible to really hold to account effectively the machinery of state. So that's where terrorism experts come in. That's where the whole of the security industry comes in. because the security industry, because it's beholden to government in terms of its funding and its resources, they have less investment in saying to government, well, hold on a second, have you thought about what you've done here? Have you thought about, you know, the role that you've played in creating the conditions for the types of disenfranchisement that we see within society more generally, not even just amongst Muslim communities. And because they have that stake, they're not asking those questions. For them, it's much easier to say, well, this is a problematic community, and they need to change. And of course, you know, this is nothing new. We've seen this throughout the entire colonial period. And instead of, say, for example, colonial powers holding themselves to account for the plethora of mass atrocities that they committed over hundreds of years, what they did is that they brought in a very, very extreme counterinsurgency measures. And they brought in, for example, in India, exceptional legislation that targeted seditious ideas and beliefs, right? And so this idea of targeting sedition is a very old one. And it's a tactic that's been used kind of consistently, you know, from the counterinsurgency work that was done in the period of colonization to now using counterinsurgency tactics in order to target a domestic community. We're not seen as part of the narrative of building the society. We're seen as a dissident community that requires being dealt with as if we are an insurgency with our own nation. And that is where the problem lies. And that's why the entire narrative of radicalization is so linear, because they can only conceive of problematic pathways that stem from the community itself rather than conditions being dealt with. And that's, you know, at Cage, we wrote a report called Beyond Prevent, where we look at what it might take to end these cycles of violence, to end kind of programs like Prevent and counterterrorism more generally. And of course, the conclusions that we came to is that, you know, you need to redirect resources away from all of the fear mongering, from the militarization, from, you know, the kind of endemic wastage that we have, especially in a Tory government who are willing to quite often waste taxpayer money, and redirect it towards services that people actually need, such as in mental health. You know, right now you have this bizarre situation where, you know, you have doctors telling us that we can't get mental health services for our patients, but if we mention, for example, that there is a radicalization risk, our patients get fast-tracked to the services they need. So you're damned either way. If you don't want to go into the narrative radicalization because you realize the harm that it causes to your patients, then they're denied the services that they need, meaning that they're at risk from a number of different directions, not, you know, just in terms of being disenfranchised from the state. But if you do go down the route of using that narrative in order to get the services you need, then you help to perpetuate the myth of radicalization itself. And so we're damned in either direction. We can't get the services we need, and we also end up reinforcing the structure of repression that affects us. So sorry, I've spoken for a while, but maybe Fahad had some comments or you have other questions for him.
Asim, you just mentioned Prevent, and I want to discuss this a little bit. Maybe Fahad, you can take this question. I suppose as part of the effort to prevent radicalization and in the broader 9/11, post 9/11 counterterrorism approach, the UK has introduced in 2003 the Prevent policy, which in 2015 has become a legal duty for public sector institutions. These institutions are basically asked to snitch and report based on suspicion, creating a climate on mutual distrust between state agencies and communities of color, since this reporting has often proven completely arbitrary and racially motivated. Just as an example, to clarify this fact, is that when Prevent counterterrorism funding was distributed to local authorities by the central government, it was done so in direct proportion to the Muslim population in a particular area. Can you help us understand what this actually mean for Muslim communities and communities of color?
So as you rightly point out, there's a lot of money from Prevent going to local government. And going back to Asim's point about accessing services, many organizations felt that the only way they could obtain funding for their projects, whether that was youth work or tackling drugs and crime in the areas, or dealing with genuine issues of domestic violence in the community, the only way you could access that funding was to put a link in your programs to de-radicalization and countering extremism. If you added those taglines and into your proposals, you were more likely to get funding. Inevitably, a lot of the Muslim community are in deprived areas and they do have these problems. So when they're applying for funding, then the funding is, the myth is perpetuated that the issue of radicalization is prevalent in Muslim communities, Muslim majority communities. So it is problematic because it's one thing getting the funding, but then you have to prove that you've done something with that funding to tackle the said radicalization. So you inevitably have to carry on creating the myth and perpetuating, ad infinitum, and that's what we've seen. Now that it's become a duty, as for the past 6 years, we've seen how problematic this is. I have carried out Prevent training for head teachers have come together and I've provided Prevent training for them. And I was shocked by how narrow they interpreted their duty, and almost any sign of a Muslim practicing their faith or becoming more devout was seen to them as a trigger. Now, interestingly, none of them believed in the program. None of them felt that they wanted to report their students. They felt it would be counterproductive to whatever objective they were seeking to tackle. And whenever I've put it to teachers and head teachers is, well, what would you normally do if you didn't have this duty? And they've come back with, well, we deal with it as teachers, as educators. If we see something's a problem, if something's unusual, we speak to the child, we find out what's happening, and we're teachers, we're educators, we're trained to deal with these issues without involving the police and involving national security. We rarely involve police in our schools. So why is an exception suddenly made when it comes to this issue of radicalization, which we think is a faff? And I found very little support for it. In fact, in all the sessions I've done, I've never found a teacher who supported it. And when it came down to delivering the program, my sessions were lasted between 3 to 4 hours in any afternoon, which is double the time that the Home Office provides. And this is no reflection on me, but more reflection on the poor qualities of Home Office training, that I've always got very positive feedback that I've helped clarify something the Home Office failed to do. And they felt more comfortable in what their duties actually were and were not at the end of that. Their impressions at the end of their training is that literally we see a Muslim who expresses an interest in religion or in certain science subjects, or expresses a view on things as diverse as cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad or the Middle East crisis. And all of these are red flags for them to report. So if this is the direction we're traveling in at the moment, in another 20 years, you can imagine how restricted our schools will become. Essentially, schools are places where young minds should be allowed to discuss, debate, argue, express opinion. And what we are seeing is we're in the trajectory of creating institutions of political indoctrination, where only one view is acceptable.
Because what this is basically creating is a preconceived profiling of young citizens and the creation of a category of second-class citizens who are by default suspicious.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the majority of these cases are coming from certain communities based on their non-violent political and religious outlook, then yes, you are creating a second-class citizen, not just with the screen on them, but internally as well. There's a lack of recognition that we are equal citizens. And if I'm constantly dealing with queries, I'm sure Asim can share this experience about people who want to leave the UK and are looking for immigration options. And it's actually increased over the last 10, 15 years. It was quite a common discussion in the community back in the early days of the war on terror. And I thought I would see that peter off, but it's increased to the extent that I've probably once a month I get a call from a new client who wants to leave the UK and wants to immigrate to another country. And he's concerned that will this be seen as me being radical, that I want to go and live in another part of the world. So even when you want to leave the country, because you're not given a sense of identity or sense of belonging, even that is deemed to be suspicious. So there's literally no move. You can't take a breath of fresh air without it being seen in a hostile light. I mean, Asim, do you have any similar? I mean, what's your experience about people?
I agree with that. I think that it was a conversation that many people had at the start of the war on terror. In fact, it was interesting. At the start of the war on terror, there was also like this countercurrent as well, which was from people who were worried about what might happen to them if they got stopped abroad because of their dual nationality. And so a lot of people were actually getting rid of the dual nationalities that they had. So if they were from Pakistan or from Morocco or wherever, they were actually actively trying to get rid of that second citizenship because they were worried that if they got detained abroad somewhere, that the UK government wouldn't intervene, because we had seen the UK government by that time give up on a number of British nationals who were detained in the countries where that person had a second nationality, and that person was being tortured, they were being detained arbitrarily, and the British government said, well, hey, look, you're a national in that country, you should make representations to your own nation. And so it was a way of the British government kind of wiping its hands clean of people. And so there were a number of people at that time who also took the view that in order to be represented correctly in the way that you should be by your own government, you should actually get rid of that citizenship. But now the conversation's shifted. I think, in a Brexit environment with, kind of a white nationalism discourse that has become so ubiquitous, I've definitely heard a lot of people saying, we don't want our kids growing up in this environment anymore, where they are subjected to kind of this daily vitriol from almost every single aspect of society. I mean, if you look at the newspapers here, what they're able to get away with saying, it's just pure unadulterated fascism. Like, there's just no other way of putting it, really. But it's common discourse now. So I think that we're probably going to see a lot more of that. And obviously, when we see the kinds of policies I think that we're going to be discussing today in place, we can see very clearly that a legal environment is being created where there is, or has been created, where there are two different sets of citizenship.
I mean, can I jump in there? Because it was interesting in the coverage of the evacuation from Kabul over the last couple of weeks. It was pointed out that even the BBC's coverage of British nationals in Afghanistan depended on the color. So white British nationals were described as British citizens. British citizens of Afghan heritage were described as passport holders. So you could see straight away there was a distinction made. And that on the ground, that affected the policy of who was getting on the flights, who was being evacuated. And priority was given to white British nationals just because they looked British, as opposed to others who looked Afghan. So there's, it's not something we can shy away from. These are the British citizens, British Afghans who the government is supposedly trying to assist, and people have helped them in their war on terror for the past 20 years. And these are those people they were trying to evacuate. So that's how they are treated. You can just imagine when those are deemed to be enemies of the state are treated.
speaking of this, I want to ask a question to both of you. Under the 1981 British Nationality Act, the UK Home Secretary has the power to revoke someone's citizenship if they are satisfied that the deprivation is conducive to the public good. I suppose this is connected to this idea of layered value of citizenship. So, what maybe a little provocatively I want to understand is that this idea of public good as very significant social, political, and more racial implications. So my question is, whose good is this public good?
I mean, the first thing to point out is even the threshold that they've set conducive to the public good. So this is the equivalent test when the UK is seeking to deport a non-British national back to their country of origin. So automatically you have equated a British citizen who you're seeking to deprive of their citizenship with a non-national, even by virtue of the threshold you're setting. Except it's almost reversed. So if you're going to deport someone, you can only deport someone if it's conducive to the public good. So that's sort of the threshold. Whereas if you're depriving someone, you can deprive them because it's conducive to the public. There's a technical difference, but it's quite interesting. Non-nationals almost have a higher protection in this regard. When you talk about the public good, so as far as the deprivation is concerned, with the vast majority of cases under this category, they argue that it's in the interest of national security. And if it's in the interest of national security, that's in the interest of everyone's good at protecting the public. I'm not sure how much discussion there is about the impact of deprivation, but there now seems to be a sort of mission creep where this has been expanded slowly. And currently there's a number of cases before the courts where individuals convicted of non-terrorism offenses, in fact, all of those who have been deprived of their citizenship based on national security have never been convicted or have not been convicted of terrorism offenses or any criminal offense. They've been punished prior to any criminal prosecution or any due process at all. And just on a tangent, if you consider the worst crime you can be punished for, whether it's murder or rape, you will initially be charged, you'll be shown the evidence against you, you'll be able to challenge that in court, you'll be able to confront your accuser, and then the evidence will go before a jury of your peers will decide whether you're guilty or innocent. And after that, you will be punished accordingly, whether that's imprisonment or anything else. And if you're convicted of the worst offenses, you might get a 40-year sentence, 50-year sentence, life sentence, but you won't be deprived of your citizenship. And here we have, with national security, since 2010, 150 individuals, or at least, who have been accused of the worst crime that you can think of today, terrorism, and punished straight away without ever having their day in court, ever seeing a shred of evidence, ever being able to confront the accuser, ever being read any rights, ever being asked questions about the crime that they're accused of. And they're punished in the most draconian manner without ever getting any element of due process. So it's a completely upside down when it comes to dealing with these matters. Now, as I said, that has been expanded to people who are convicted of non-terrorism offenses, namely child sexual exploitation offenses. Now, no matter, regardless of our opinion about whether that's correct or not, and I'm sure no one agrees with the crimes that people are convicted of in this regard, but why should those individuals then go on to suffer a second penalty? That if they were white English people, they wouldn't. So at the moment, I'm representing someone who was convicted of child sexual exploitation offenses, who served his time and was released from prison several years ago. He is third generation British. His grandfather came to this country in the 1960s and became a UK citizen. His father came here as a young child, 6 years old, and became a UK citizen. And he was born a UK citizen in this country. And now he's lost his citizenship and they're trying to deport him to Pakistan from where he's only been a handful of times as a child. What connection does he have, and why should he lose his citizenship? Whereas if he was just a white Englishman convicted of the same or worse offenses, he wouldn't be. If you're talking about the public good and trying to protect the public, well then somebody is equally dangerous if they happen to be a different skin color to the one that you're targeting at the moment. So to answer your question, I think the public good is not actually being addressed with this. It's clearly filtered racial bias.
Asim, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that we just take into account that this moves across a number of different areas of the law. So yes, citizenship deprivation is one arbitrary tool that the Home Secretary will use, but they can also use it in other ways. So they can deprive you of your passport, so you can't travel out of the country. They can ban you from entering into the country. And in some cases that we've documented, they can even kind of claim to safeguard your children by taking them away and placing them in the care of the state. And as Fahad's kind of already set out so well, these are punishments that are given arbitrarily in advance of any legal contestation. There is no process here. In order to, in these cases, in order to get your rights back, you have to then go through a secret court system, whether it's in the High Court or it's in the Special Immigration Appeals Commissions, that you have to go through a process where the evidence, the fundamental evidence that they're using against you, is being held more often than not under some form of secrecy. And that secrecy means that, and Fahad's been through these processes as, somebody who practices the law. It's something that you are denied seeing, but also that your lawyer is denied seeing as well. That's the crazy thing, right? That we don't talk about enough. We talk about all forms of injustices that take place in the court systems of countries like Morocco and Egypt and Pakistan and other countries around the world. But if any of those countries practice this in the way that UK currently practices it now, right, they would be condemned internationally for it. But because, unfortunately, we have a liberal class of society that believes that somehow if you invoke the idea of human rights safeguards as a very loose and amorphous term, that somehow this makes everything better. I can guarantee you, for the people who have to deal with the consequences of this legislation, this policy, having this amorphous idea of human rights safeguards really doesn't make any difference on the ground. When you go through the process, it's destructive. And it's not just destructive to you and your family, it's destructive to everybody in your community. And in many ways, the Muslim community is not like other communities in the sense that we have like 2 degrees of separation from one another. When something affects somebody within the community, everyone finds out very, very quickly. And that climate of fear that emerges from these movements is huge. And it has a devastating kind of knock-on effect. So when we talk about the impact of these policies, yes, it's the individual cases, but the ramifications of these cases are huge. And we need to really think about that when we talk about it. And I really believe that kind of liberal notions of human rights safeguards is the thing that actually ends up harming us more than anything else, because we're sold this lie that somehow we can make the system work, which we can't. The system is broken, and there is all manner of violence taking place because of it.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question that is very much connected to this, I would like to ask the audience if there is any question, please do send it to us and we'll share it to our speakers. So my next question connected to this, all-encompassing human rights defense is the other notion that is all-powerful, that is the interest of national security that you both touched upon. When the interest of national security is invoked, the state is basically beyond scrutiny and accountability, and the level of arbitrariness, irrespective of where you are, becomes immense. Can you help us understand how this endless appeal to the eminent priorities of national security have had an impact on the scope of how we are allowed to practice our rights as citizens? And this is for both of you.
Yeah, sure, I can take a stab at that first. I mean, these states of exception, again, they're nothing new. They're utilized all over the world in various circumstances. I think one of the key aspects of the global war on terror is the malignancy of the 9/11 narrative. And so countries all over the world immediately use that framing in order to justify the continued and furthering repression of other populations that they already had some degree of control over and power over. So, for example, we saw the language of the war on terror, utilized immediately in India against Kashmiris. We saw it being utilized by Aung San Suu Kyi in the case of Myanmar and the Rohingya Muslims. Somebody who's a Nobel, former Nobel Peace Prize winner, having her award taken away from her because of her validating, using the discourse of the global war on terror, the repression and the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Rohingya Muslims. But of course, interestingly, even with so-called political opponents of the US, so for example, China, when the war on terror first came about, the US was so keen that there was no international disagreement or disgruntlement with what it was doing in places like Guantanamo Bay and secret prison sites, that it made all sorts of deals with the Chinese, say, for example, with the relationship they had with their Uyghur population, to bring that within the scope of the global war on terror. So immediately the Uyghurs that were being detained at Guantanamo Bay were rebranded, not as kind of individuals, even if they were or weren't, but as part of a movement to end, colonial domination of China within East Turkestan. But it's reframed as kind of terrorists who are fighting against China. So these things have a way of in terms of that national security argument, of spilling out of all control. And now, of course, the US is saying, well, look at how terrible China is with the Uyghur. And of course, that they've done some things that ostensibly look very good, but they set the narrative to validate what's going on in the first place. Even when you look at the programs of de-radicalization that the Chinese run, when you understand that in the context of the UK's prevent strategy being explicitly outsourced to China, so they use that framing based on what the UK was selling around the world, then you get about an understanding of how the tendrils of the war on terror and the way that it interconnects with these various manifestations. And so it's gone beyond all control. And it's in everybody's interests, all these states who repress their populations, to take on that narrative, to say that, hey, what I'm doing, this repression that I'm doing isn't repression, it's just me fighting terrorism in the name of the global war on terror, in the name of global peace and security, which is kind of the mantra that they live by. But of course, what the reality of that is that arbitrary detention is endemic, incommunicado detention is endemic, or pandemic, in fact. We have torture being used across the world. Now what was formerly a recognized international violation is now rebranded as enhanced interrogation techniques. And so that's where we are with kind of the security states around the world, that every single state has adopted the language of the global war on terror and uses it to justify repression.
Also, you mentioned China quite rightly, and I think most right-minded people, when they see the repression in China, can call it out and condemn it. And I think there's been universal condemnation for many who would disagree with on many other issues, but I think everyone can be united on that. A more subtle example of national security policies being used and language being used to inflict violence on a population in a way that's acceptable to many people is in France. So in France, you have a situation where Muslim women are prohibited from working, have restrictions placed on them accessing education and healthcare simply because of the way they dress. Again, it's timely because we're being told that in Afghanistan, women are being restricted from all of these things and we should go to war and hit them with economic sanctions. And right next door, in an ally country, we have the same Muslim women. I mean, ironically, if Afghan refugees end up in France and they insist on wearing their hijab because they want to, they will be denied an education, they will be denied healthcare, they will be denied the ability to earn a living, to be a journalist, to be any of the great professions that they have been told they can be. And that will all be in the name of the war on terror, that'll be all in the name of secularism, all in the name of freedom. So it is this, I think it's important that we don't get straddled with someone like China where everyone can call it out, but the most subtle points are stuff like happening with France, which is sort of like a halfway house between Prevent UK and Prevent China, is the Prevent in France. And unless more is done to address that kind of discussion, which again, it's not just in France, it's happening increasingly across continental Europe. And we need to be flagging those cases more often. And then and ultimately it goes back down to what this discussion is all about. A second-class citizenship, you will never really belong, no matter, you might have the passport, you might have the documents, you might be born here and speak fluently the language, but ultimately you don't belong here. You look different, you are different.
I suppose quite an emblematic case to discuss this is the controversial story of Shamima Begum. Maybe analyzing that particular case can help us understand how this is, the incredible complexities of all the issues that we've been addressing now. Just for our audience, she's a British citizen of Bangladeshi descent, and she left London to join ISIS as a teenager in 2015. And in Raqqa, she married a Dutch citizen who had left his country to join the caliphate as well. Both of them fled when the caliphate collapsed, and she was later found in a refugee camp in northern Syria. In 2019, the Home Secretary Sajid Javid announced that the government's intention to strip Begum of her British citizenship, given the fact that she was supposedly Bangladeshi. But then she was of Bangladeshi origin, but she was born in Britain and never visited Bangladesh in her life. Now, Bangladesh announced that she wouldn't be welcome. She wasn't a Bangladeshi citizen. She wouldn't be welcome in Bangladesh. And would she enter the country, she would be subjected to death penalty. Then in July 2020, the Court of Appeal ruled that Begum should be permitted to return to the UK in order to fairly contest the decision of being stripped of her citizenship. But then in 2021, the Supreme Court ruled that she would not be allowed to return. How do we make sense of all this?
I mean, I'll just jump in because I know Asim will finish off with them. You can't make sense of it without understanding the racial elements to British nationality law and the whole politics of how we've got to where we are. And obviously we are limited by time, so we can't go into that in too much detail. But it is interesting, the narrative and how you've framed it, because there's an alternative way of looking at it as well, is that this is a young girl who was groomed online and became a victim of a forced marriage. And if this had happened in the UK setting, if you had a young English girl, similar age, who had run away from home and married, entered a relationship with a man many years her senior, who had manipulated her and then subjected to abuse and rape, we would have called it, because she's underage. We would never ever have questioned her motives. We would never have questioned, blamed her for what she did. Even the manner in which she was interviewed on TV by journalists, it would never happen in the UK. We mentioned the child sexual exploitation gangs earlier on. If any of their victims, these young girls who were on the face of it voluntarily involved in relationships with these men, was one way of spinning it. Another way is to say that they were groomed. Yes, they said they were happy, but after it came out what had happened, there is no chance that any of them would be actually allowed to give a television interview without their social worker being present, without an appropriate adult being present. Shamima is living in a war zone. She's lost 3 children, been a victim of grooming. God knows what atrocities she's witnessed in her time in Syria, and she's stuck in a destitute camp with desperate conditions. Now, how can anyone then take what she says at face value? The way that the entire world just turned on this young girl, rather than accepting that she'd been groomed, and even the part played by Prevent in all of this, that the counter-extremism unit who were monitoring her and her friends and suspected that she may be being groomed, they put a letter for her parents in her bag to give to the parents rather than contact the parents directly. And this is the problem. When you have, what we're seeing Prevent officers are dealing directly with children rather than with their parents. And they say, no, we're allowed to deal with the parents, with the children, because we see this as a form of abuse. If the child is being abused by the parent ideologically, we don't want to basically involve the parent at this stage. But what you do is this is what happens. If the child is hiding it just as much from the parent, and what happened, they ran away. Now, for me, the most damning indictment of the fact that Shamima should never have lost her citizenship is a counter-extremism document produced by Sajid Javid a year earlier, in which he detailed, and in great detail, about how they would deal with a British citizen and a female who went to Syria and married an ISIS member, and then wanted to come back to the UK and turned up with her child or pregnant. And it's set out in black and white. The procedure to deal with this is to check whether impose a temporary exclusion order, which will enable them to manage her return safely, have the baby checked by social services, investigate her if she's committed any criminal wrongdoing, and prosecute her appropriate, keep her under surveillance. It's not mentioned that she would be deprived of her citizenship. Yeah, when Shamima Begum turns up, on camera, and the whole world is watching, and there's a leadership contest on the horizon for Sajid Javid, and he seeks to take political mileage out of this young lady, and just plays to the crowd and deprives of her citizenship. Now, interestingly, until that point, we are told that she wasn't so dangerous that she needed to be deprived of her citizenship. The point of TV cameras has been in Syria for 3 or 4 years. During that time, over 100 British citizens have lost their citizenship over suspected alignment with Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-aligned groups or ISIS. Shamima Begum, who everyone knows is in Syria, everyone knows is accused of being with ISIS, but there's no assessment made that she is such a threat that she should be deprived of her citizenship. Yet, with the demise of the so-called caliphate, with Shamima Begum desperate, widowed, grieving with 3 dead children, at that point, she is deemed to be a threat to national security, that she loses her citizenship. That doesn't make sense. And the only way you can make it sense is how Muslims are once again being used as political footballs for other people's career aspirations. And until we recognize that and we try to tackle that, we are going to be in this perpetual cycle.
I suppose this gives us a full sense of how, yeah, citizenship is not at all a universal category that we would wish it to be, and how much we are blinded by this hidden ideology that we pretend not to have, that is such that makes a certain number of citizens second class and leave others to be judged by different standards. We are very close to our 1 hour mark. I have a question that is only marginally unrelated to the discussion, and this is connected to the image that circulated this morning on social media of the last American soldier walking out of Afghanistan, an image that is quite memorable. I wonder if there is any chance that after 20 years, we are beginning a time of reckoning.
Yeah, I don't think we should make too much of this. I mean, it is an important moment, but in terms of the entire edifice of the global war on terror, I think we have a lot more work to do. A lot more work still needs to be done. I think this was on the cards for a very long time in terms of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Americans were, they weren't making any appreciable difference there whatsoever. It's a 20-year failed project, and so it was inevitable that they would leave at some point. That has been brought about largely because of the fact that they failed in what they set out to achieve. The fact that that Afghanistan is built up of the very communities that they were fighting. It's not like there were foreign interlopers in that country. And so, when you take people's self-determination rights away from them, then of course that often leads to resistance, and one that is more effective than your ability to occupy them from abroad. And so, I think the inevitability of Afghanistan doesn't necessarily equate to the inevitability of the rest of the global war on terror. I think because of a system that is very much built on white supremacy, is so pervasive across the world, it's very difficult for them to detach themselves from the logic that is centered in the war on terror, which is that of perpetual threat. They would have to philosophically detach themselves from the idea that somehow, there are kind of dangers behind every rock and behind every tree before they could get to the place where something like just a decent system that is full of due process. Forget about citizenship, because I think that is in some ways it's a false ideal in so many respects when we consider the interplay between, for example, militarization and occupation and settler colonialism and neoliberalism. When you take into account all of these different kind of varied oppressions that take place around the world, then we end up in a situation where citizenship becomes meaningless, because the kind of lives that we live in the Western world are very much built off of the back of third world labor. The world is globalized far beyond citizenship being a useful category for us to think through in terms of rights and the kind of rights that people have. And so I think we're Afghanistan, it's an important moment, of course, in and of its own right. It's going to be very important for Afghans in particular, but I don't necessarily think it tells us any kind of story about the global war on terror. I think we have a lot more work to do before we can bring that edifice to a close and an end, which is really what our joint international witness campaign is about.
Slavery ended many centuries ago, but we're still living with the effects of that psychological impact about how Black people are treated today around the world. I think the war on terror will be with us for many generations, unfortunately. It takes a long time to wipe out in terms of, we talk about Muslims having PTSD as a result of, and the oppressed having PTSD and trauma as a result of what they've experienced. But those who are inflicting these wounds on Muslim communities, whether that be directly or indirectly or subconsciously, it's going to take time for those minds to be cleaned up and to be disinfected, so to speak, so that they can see things a little clearer than what they've been indoctrinated to believe for so long.
Well, my wish is that we continue our work to undo the indoctrination and to speak the truth to power. So I thank you for your contribution, and I thank everyone for joining us today, and I apologize for the technical glitches throughout. Thank you very much for being with us, and please follow the International Witness campaign that Cage has just set up, and support us, both Cage and the Polis Project, if you appreciate the work we do. Thank you very much.